At last!
New Tempest 2000.
What's that?
Only on the Jaguar 64-bit by Atari. Do the math.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the arcade here on Player One Start. Back in the 1980s, the arcade was the best place to go to find the latest and greatest in technology for video games, as well as gameplay trends. And most likely the number one genre at this time were space-themed shooters. With this genre being kicked off by Space Invaders, a lot of these early titles would have the spaceship at the bottom of the screen shooting up at enemies descending from above. However, Atari was experimenting with several different technologies to provide a 3D perspective, and with the technology of the time, that meant making wire-framed vector graphics. And although there will be several iconic titles released in this style, one of the earliest and most popular had to be the game Tempest. The origins of the game Tempest is not actually one that I was expecting. Listen here to the game's developers talking about what they initially planned and what eventually became Tempest.
Tempest started out as first-person Space Invaders, and I brought it up, we played it, we had a marketing review, and they said, this first-person Space Invaders, but it's not much fun. Do you have any ideas, Dave? And I says, well, I got this idea where there's this hole in the ground and there's monsters coming out. And I can make this thing into that hole in the ground nightmare. And so they came back like 2 weeks later and they said, this is fun, let's do this, and that was Tempest.
So after deciding on creating a hole in which monsters try to crawl out of and attack you, the game started to take shape. During the prototype stages, the game was called Aliens, then Vortex, before finally landing on the name Tempest. There were eventually 3 different cabinet designs for the Tempest arcade machine. The most common is the upright cabinet that is viewed from the side. It has the shape of a right triangle sitting on top of a rectangle. This cabinet featured colorful side art, however there was a shorter and less flashy cabaret-style cabinet that was also used with optional side art. The third was a cocktail-style machine that allowed 2 players to play at opposite ends of the table, with the screen automatically flipping for each player. In the first games that shipped from Atari, there were a few glitches in one or more of the ROM chips. The problem code allowed a player to do unintended things when ending their score in a certain 2-digit combination. According to Joystick Magazine, which detailed these combinations, the most useful were the ones that earned the player 40 free credits. After these issues were discovered, Atari did correct the problem so that further shipping machines were incapable of allowing the end score tricks. Tempest was one of the first games to use Atari's Quadra-Scan color vector display. Up until this point, all vector graphics machines relied on color-tinted overlays to provide one or more colors to graphics. At that time, vector displays were mainly monotone, meaning they could only produce one color, and whatever color that was, it couldn't change. This is an example of the Vectrex that used vector graphics. Notice that it is in black and white, but when I apply one of the colored overlays, it gives the graphics some nice colored detail. Using this new technology, they would be able to display multiple colors at once on screen, without the use of colored overlays. This is also the first game that allowed players to choose their starting level, a system Atari called Skill Step. This feature increases the maximum starting level depending on the player's performance in the previous game, essentially allowing the player to continue where they left off. Another revolutionary concept that we take for granted today is that this is one of the first games that offered a progressive level design, where the levels themselves varied rather than just giving the player the same layout with increasing difficulty, like in Space Invaders. The game was eventually released in October of 1981. The goal of Tempest is to survive for as long as possible and score as many points as you can. This is done by clearing the screen of enemies that appear on the playfield. The player controls a blaster near the end of the playfield and moves it left or right using a rotary knob attached to the console. The player's blaster can fire rapid shots down individual lanes of the playfield, destroying any enemies within the same lane. The blaster is also equipped with a super zapper, which, once per level, destroys all enemies on the playfield. A second use of the super zapper in the same level destroys one random enemy, and the super zapper is recharged between each level. Each level is laid out as a geometric shape, and there are 16 different unique shapes throughout the game. Some levels have closed tubes that allow the player to loop throughout it continuously, while others have definite left and right endpoints that keep the player from going around in circles. When all 16 levels have been played, the sequence repeats itself with a different color scheme and a higher difficulty. When all enemies on the playfield have been destroyed, the player warps to the next level by traveling down the field and into the space beyond it. The player must avoid or destroy any spikes that are there in the way, but if you hit one, it will destroy your blaster and force the player to try the warp again. If you are unsuccessful though, you will lose a life, either when your blaster is destroyed or captured, and the game ends when all of your lives are lost, though you can earn additional lives by achieving certain score levels. Overall, this is one of my favorite arcade games on the Arcade 1-Up Atari Centipede Asteroids combo cabinet. And that's saying something because I usually don't enjoy vector games on non-vector monitors being recreated with pixels instead. But here it really is the repetitive gameplay that I find interesting. There's a lot of strategy that goes into this simple concept that is easy to pick up, but difficult to master. And my preferred way of playing this is on the arcade cabinet with the control knob, as I have a hard time controlling where I'm going using a directional pad or a joystick. My biggest criticism is that the entire game becomes nothing more than a reflex challenge when you get into the upper levels, but in all honesty, I feel like that's a lot of games, so I don't really hold it too much against this one. You are also only competing for a high score, as there is no way to beat this game, it just keeps going until you can't play anymore. But that's just all arcade games from the 1980s. There's also something that appeals to me about these wireframe graphics in multiple colors. Despite lacking a lot of detail and only using 4 colors at a time, there's something that mesmerizes me and draws me into this game. And the laser sound effects and explosions are just very satisfying when you actually take out enemies and fire your blaster. Overall, I couldn't recommend this game enough and would definitely recommend it to those of you that have access to it. When looking for home ports of Tempest, it's actually very hard to come across in the early 1980s. An official port was released for the Atari ST, and there was an official port that bears the Atari logo that was released by Superior Software for the BBC Micro and Acorn Electron. Then in 1985, there was another port developed for the ZX Spectrum and the Amstrad CPC in 1987. There were versions for the Atari 2600 and 5200 that were in the works at Atari during 1984. However, due to circumstances at that company, those unfinished prototypes still exist for both of them, but were never released officially from Atari. The game was released for Microsoft Windows as part of the Microsoft Arcade package, and the original version of Tempest was included in Atari's Greatest Hits for the PlayStation, Sega Saturn, and Super Nintendo. Tempest also appeared in the Atari Anniversary Edition released for PC and the Dreamcast, as well as the Atari Anniversary Edition Redux on the PlayStation 1. In 2005, Tempest came out for the Atari Anthology Collection for Xbox and PS2, and strangely enough, the PC version of that game also included the Atari 2600 prototype. Also that year, a graphical remix of the original Tempest was included as part of the Retro Atari Classics for the Nintendo DS. This version deviates significantly from the basic rules and experience of the original game. Tempest was also released for the Xbox 360 in 2007, which is available for purchase through the Xbox Live Arcade. This version includes the original arcade game and an evolved version with updated graphics. This version is also found on the PSP Atari Classics Evolved collection. Eventually, the Atari 5200 prototype was found in 1999, and eventually, the original programmer resumed work on finishing the port. It was then published by Atari Age in 2013 and can be found at various sources online. Shortly after the original game was released, an arcade owner named Duncan Brown hacked the level data and made an altered, more difficult version called Tempest Tubes. This version was eventually included with Tempest in the Hasbro collection Atari Arcade Hits Volume 1 for PC in 1999. Jeff Minter, however, created 2 authorized sequels released long after the original game, the first of which was Tempest 2000 in 1994 for the Atari Jaguar. In this game, you again take control of the claw-shaped blaster spacecraft from the original game, and the player has to survive and travel across multiple levels until the end of an intergalactic war, battling against a variety of enemies that appear on the playfield. Tempest 2000 modifies the gameplay of the original by adding more power-ups, bonus levels, more sophisticated enemy types, and more widely varying web level designs. The game features a total of 100 web levels. Progress is automatically saved after completing a couple of levels, and players are allowed to resume by using keys to return to the last stage the game was saved at. There are also additional gameplay modes in addition to the main game. Completing all levels in Tempest 2000 unlocks Beastly Mode, which is a harder difficulty setting, where enemies move faster, fire more often, and are more resilient to the player's shots. In addition, the player's ship fires at a lower rate than the original difficulty. When initially released, Tempest 2000 was critically acclaimed, with critics praising the graphics, gameplay, and soundtrack. Out of the few games that actually released for the Atari Jaguar, Tempest 2000 is often credited as one of the top games. And this is one I would consider essential for owning for an Atari Jaguar if you're lucky enough to have one. Otherwise, if you want to experience this game, it also received ports to the PlayStation, Saturn, and PC. However, I have heard each of those versions are a bit different from the original. Tempest has had a profound impact on the gaming community. Not only did this game spawn a plethora of sequels and be ported to almost every platform that's out there, there were also a myriad of clones and other ripoffs. Tempest played a crucial role also in shaping the evolution of game design. Its vector graphics were a departure from the pixel-based visuals usually seen in most games of that era. The game showcased the potential of vector graphics, offering crisp, smooth lines that created a distinctive aesthetic. The visual style would go on to influence future arcade and home game consoles, setting a new standard for graphical presentation. Beyond the impact of the game industry, Tempest left a lasting impact on American culture itself, becoming one of those iconic symbols of the arcade gaming era. Its geometric and abstract design stood out among crowded arcade cabinets, attracting attention and drawing in players. The success of Tempest contributed to the rise of arcade gaming as a social activity, where players would gather in arcades to compete for high scores and share gaming experiences. This game's popularity also helped solidify Atari's position as the leading arcade developer, and it further entrenched video games as a mainstream form of entertainment. Overall, it is hard to overstate the impact of Tempest on the video game industry and American culture, and its influence can still be seen today, with its legacy evident in the design and aesthetics of modern games, as well as the enduring nostalgia for the golden age of arcade gaming. If you like this video and you'd like to help out with future projects on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. A special thanks to those Patreons you see on screen. Also, if you like what you see, please remember to leave a like and click that subscribe button on your way out. As always, I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.